And there's like positive elements to it as well, just as I think there are positive elements to US hegemony today.
Hmm.
But it is the British that sort of knit, or rather, knit through their wisdom, or savagely, brutally threw together
Yes,
the modern world that we live in today. It was sort of the British that established a lot of the
the
ways
status
of
quo.
running the status quo, the ways of running the world that the United States just sort of picked up and ran with.
Welcome to the More Freedom Foundation podcast, brought to you by political expert Robert Morris and that man you wish would stop interrupting him, Rory MacLeod.
Hello, Rory. How are you?
I'm very well. Rob, how are you?
No complaints. No complaints. It's an interesting week as ever here in the United States. And how are things going over there?
Well, we've been told that any growth over the past 7 years has now been annihilated, and to look forward to a recession and higher taxes for everyone.
Wow, that sounds great.
It does, it does.
That must be a delight. So you're saying that Rishi Sunak has not in fact solved everything?
Well, he's claiming that this is how you solve it. With
Oof.
Jeremy Hunt, who was hated for what he did to the NHS, so he thought he'd do the same
Mhm.
to the entire United Kingdom.
It does very much seem to be like meet the new boss, same as the old boss with the Conservatives. I mean, hasn't
Well,
this
they
been
had
sort
one
of
that went tax cuts for the rich, and then the markets panicked, and then she got thrown out. And now we have
Mhm.
Sunak, who was trying to finalize his paperwork for moving to America since the becoming prime minister didn't work out, and then had to quickly get back into the competition and eventually won.
Oh, man, I did not know that. Yeah, I mean, see, but it just seems like the Conservatives have had the same up. Things are bad. We've got to do austerity. I
Well,
mean, I feel
yeah,
like I've been hearing that
it is
for
the default.
since 2008 or so. It just
Yes,
sort of keeps coming back.
even though it seemed that Labour had sort of managed most of the damage that had come from the subprime mortgage. So yeah, they used to blame everything was the subprime mortgages was all Labour's fault, was what
Oh,
they'd say.
really?
So yeah, that's how they spun it. It was like, oh, they spent too much on police and nurses, so now
That's
you're not allowed anything
that's
nice.
That's impressive. I mean, the Republicans and the Democrats in the United States, have books, libraries at this point dedicated to blaming each other for the 2008 financial crisis. I think
Hmm.
but it turns out it's actually the British Labor
It
Party that
was
is responsible
Gordon
for the
Brown.
U.S.
It was
launched
all his
financial
fault.
crisis.
Yes.
That resolves a lot. I've been at, was it Clinton's deregulatory actions? Was it Bush being asleep at the wheel? No, 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 no. It was Gordon Brown who sent the U.S. mortgage
Well, there might
market
be
into a
more
tizzy.
unity in America now they've found out.
It's funny because I in my own work, I actually tend to lean towards blaming Britain for everything. Uh, but
Okay.
I, I but I sort of cut that off when
Is
the
it a
United
longer
States
time
takes
frame?
over. Yeah, sort of in the 19th century, I'd say, like
Okay.
much of the modern world.
The
And
good
there
old
are
days.
the good old days, the good old days. And there's like positive elements to it as well, just as I think there are positive elements to US hegemony today.
Hmm.
But it is the British that sort of knit, or rather, knit through their wisdom, or savagely, brutally threw together
Yes.
the modern world that we live in today. It was sort of the British that established a lot of the
The
ways
status
of
quo.
running the status quo, the ways of running the world that the United States just sort of picked up and ran with.
So, what would be your main takeaway for America to prevent what inevitably ended up with the British Empire?
Fight fewer wars. Look for
Hmm.
fewer wars. It's just
Yeah.
the scale. It's something else that's really similar is looking at conflicts, specifically the Boer War, and just looking at the incredible
Hmm.
scale that the British could operate on compared to absolutely everybody else, and how.
And inventing the concentration camp in the
Well,
process.
yes, exactly. Famously, the British invented the concentration camp. in their
Hmm.
fight against the Boers in South Africa. But they were getting
Yeah.
their asses handed to them so clearly in the Boer War. But what's extraordinary, I've looked at this number multiple times and checked it multiple times because I think it's so ridiculous. So the British got in, I think, was it the second Boer War that went so disastrously for them? The first one didn't go too well
Hmm.
for them either. But
Yeah.
they found themselves sort of humiliated by these sort of Afrikaans speaking Dutch descended white settlers, the Boers,
Hmm.
in Africa. They were so humiliated they just had to double down and double down and double down. And eventually they transported, this is in the 19th century, they transported 500,000 troops to South Africa to fight the
Wow.
Boer War. So they were just operating on this insane scale that nobody else could
Yeah.
touch. The problem was that they managed to so alienate the rest of the world and so militarize the rest of the world. I mean, Europe was playing a desperate, desperate game of catch up throughout the scramble for
Hmm.
Africa. And through a lot of the scramble for Africa, like the British did a pretty good job of presenting the fiction that it was a equal thing.
Unbeatable
No,
force.
the opposite, in fact. They presented the fiction that like there was some kind of equality or competition between European powers for Africa when
Hmm.
there really wasn't. The
Yeah.
British took the parts of Africa that were economically profitable. That was sort of
It felt were the most useful, most
exactly
viable.
Egypt, the Suez Crisis. Talk about financial. I mean, the French thought that they were going to do this big end run around the British by working with the
Hmm.
Egyptians to build this canal. And then the British quickly did a little bit of financial wizardry where they owned half the canal and then figured out how to not just own half the canal, but in 1880 or something like 1882, I think it was, take physical
Hmm.
control of all of Egypt. So the British controlled Egypt with the incredibly strategically important Suez Canal. They controlled South Africa
Hmm.
with the mines there. In the 19th century, the incredible resources that the rest of Africa had weren't really appreciated or particularly useful at that point. You didn't need to build
Yeah.
many electric cars or nuclear power plants in the 19th century. So you had,
Yeah.
nominally, it's like, oh, Germany had a slice and Belgium had a slice and France had a slice, but these were not
Hmm.
slices that were actually useful. There's this famous Fashoda incident, which if you read like just a textbook overview, this is a moment of extraordinary tension between France and Britain in the scramble for Africa. And they talk about Lord Kitchener and his army facing off against a French army in furthest Sudan. Well, you read the
Hmm.
details, and Kitchener came down, I believe, yes, the Nile River with multiple gunboats with cannon. He actually built his own purpose-built railway to get his tens of thousands of British and Egyptian troops down to the heart of the Sudan. I
Wow.
mean, he was. I believe this was part of the
Hmm.
same campaign where he defeated the Mahdi, the Sudanese religious fanatic who had killed the British religious fanatic we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
And the British guy literally, sorry, this is the British side, hyper industrial, railway, gunboats, tens of
Yes.
thousands of soldiers. The French guy rocked up on a thick wheeled bicycle with 17 soldiers. And this is the Fashoda incident.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
billed as an
if
equal
you read
fight.
about the Fashoda incident in a history of the 19th century, like
Hmm.
I think it might have actually come up in that new Silk Roads book. They'll talk about like
Okay.
this clash between France and Britain that barely that almost tipped them over into war, and it's just like gee, like tipped them over into
Hmm.
war. It's like it would literally have been the work of 5 minutes for Kitchener to wipe out
Yes.
the French there, and that would have been the case everywhere else in the world at the time. We talk a lot about the Great
Hmm.
Game. You look at the armies that Russia would send to parts that then nominally became a part of the Russian Empire, to take Central Asia in the 1860s and 70s. These
Yeah.
were armies that almost never amounted to more than 1,000 or 5,000 people. And this is,
But weren't there also parts of Russia Britain had discovered before Russia did?
yes, yes. And one of the really humiliating things for the Russians was that there were parts of Russia that were much more connected to British goods and merchant networks, economically speaking, for sure. But
Hmm.
so the French, are sending people with a bicycle and 17 people. The Russians are conquering parts that have become part of their empire with, expeditionary forces
Yeah, a
of
very
two or
small
three
amount of
thousand
people.
people, and the British can literally send an army of 500,000 to the other side of the planet. Like that's how
Yeah, when it
just
needs to.
out of scale they were.
That's something Russia can't do
I mean,
today.
they can't make it 50 miles from their border today.
Yeah.
And so the British were similarly dominant. This is the Boer War we're talking. This is,
Hmm.
I think, the Second Boer War ended up somewhere in 1902, 1905 region.
The warm up for World War One.
In many ways, yes. And the United States is similarly dominant today. But what the British did is that they just
Yeah.
had to keep, and they did not need to fight that way in South Africa. They just had a number of
Yeah.
commercial interests. It was diamond mines back then. Now it's Raytheon and weapons manufacturers today. They had a number of commercial interests
Hmm.
that, for the benefit of not for the British public, not even for the British Empire, just for like very small um, uh, unrepresentative interests like Raytheon or McDonnell Douglas
Yeah.
or what have you, kept getting into these completely unnecessary fights. And no matter how dominant you
Hmm.
are, war is unpredictable. War is damaging. And
Absolutely. And it can show your
exactly.
cracks.
And eventually, if you just keep doing dumb stuff and keep pushing into wars, you're eventually gonna get into a situation that you can't handle. I'll be honest. I thought for years that Russia Ukraine was going to be an example of one of those places where like the British.
America wouldn't be able to, show their
Well,
strength.
like with the British in Western Europe, eventually getting,
Hmm.
they won World War One, but did they really? They essentially bankrupted themselves. And
Yeah.
I talked about how in the 19th century, Britain owned the United States. Well, after 1917, because of World War One, the United States owned Britain. I mean, that's pretty. The war would have
Definitely.
ended with British bankruptcy in the spring of 1917 if it were
Hmm.
not for the U.S. government deciding to back them. And
Hmm.
the British, despite always being tremendously more powerful than the Germans on the world stage, got themselves into a
Yeah.
situation where the Germans cared more than the British did, or were more.
Hmm.
It's like a human being intentionally sticking their face into a bee's nest. A human is always going to beat a bunch of bees unless the human is stupid enough
You,
to put themselves in a
yeah.
position where the bees have the advantage. And in World War One, the British were
Hmm.
stupid enough to put themselves in a position where the German bees had an advantage. And I had this fear, and of course, the entire United States War on Terror is an example of,
Yeah.
not to in any way, I'm perfectly happy to dehumanize Germans, but I'm that way. But I don't want to dehumanize Middle Easterners in any way. But for the sake of
Oh,
analogy,
yes.
the United States was stupid enough to stick its face in the bee's nest of Iraq and Afghanistan, and was
Hmm.
humiliated for doing so.
Because would you say it was all for military contractors and very little other
Yes,
purpose?
I would absolutely say that. The problem is that I think, I mean, I'd qualify that a little bit, and I think this is a real problem with a lot of pundits and a lot of friends of mine around China and Russia as
Hmm.
well, because it is the only real benefit it's for is for defense contractors. But I think a lot of smart people who can see that there's actually no real threat to the United States from Russia and China
Hmm.
also have incorporated this idea. I don't even necessarily want to call it a myth because it's backed by a lot of historical
Evidence.
evidence. But I think that a lot of people have convinced themselves that, yeah, obviously Russia and China are like joke countries that present no threat to the United
Hmm.
States or really any U.S. interests. But they've convinced themselves that, well, the United States just functions better when we have an enemy. So these are sort of they're
Oh.
just smart, well-meaning people who are just like, well, like the U.S. is just works better together, and we don't actually want to fight a war with China or Russia, and we don't
Hmm.
actually don't see them as any kind of real threat. But the U.S. is just less polarized and less partisan if we have an enemy we're pulling together against.
How difficult do you think it would be for America to not need an enemy, to just be happy enough to be number one and not feel
I
threatened?
think it would be. I think it's very difficult, but I think it's also essential.
Because I keep thinking about the threat of the EU and Japan. It's almost like if they have a bigger GDP, it's like, so what? They'll probably just let you do what
Hmm.
you're doing.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? It's like if the EU, let's say, became, financially richer than
Hmm.
America, I can't see them suddenly then deciding to go into a big war in Brazil for no reason. Do you know what
Yeah,
I mean?
I agree. I agree entirely. And
Won't start doing America stuff, and it won't then go, well, we're number one, so we'll have to attack America. That's how this
yeah, well,
works.
it's a crazy thing, and it's again, I think, for the benefit of a few interests, a few defense companies, that we continue to think along these
Hmm.
lines, because we don't need. I would argue, honestly, we haven't needed um,
An
power.
enemy.
Well, I don't think anybody has really gotten any real benefit out of war since industrialization. Obviously, there are
Yeah.
examples where individual national groups have you know brought themselves success through war or what have you. I mean, even as recently as
Hmm.
Azerbaijan won its 30-year war with Armenia in 2020. But they never really had to.
But that's now livened up as well.
Well, it has with Russia no longer acting as a guarantor. But
Yes. And they asked for help, and Russia was like, we're a little busy
yeah,
here.
but the United States has stepped in. I did a short on that recently, and it
Hmm.
seems to be working all right. But my broader point is that, like, you don't need to do war anymore, and that's what's so goddamn
Yeah.
frustrating about the United States. Is like, honestly, I
Hmm.
talk about the conflict in Ethiopia, which is a horrific conflict that may have killed 500,000 people,
Yeah.
but I talk about it because I kind of like it in a, I guess, it's weird or sick way. The Ethiopian conflict is interesting for me to follow as a U.S. taxpayer, because it's the only conflict that has killed more than 10,000 people this century that I'm not responsible for as a U.S. taxpayer. The United
Hmm.
States is intimately
Yeah.
involved, if not the direct creator, of every conflict in the 21st century that has killed more than 10,000 people. Except for
Okay.
Ethiopia. Like, Ethiopia is like pretty much, no, and to be clear, that's taking like an expanded view of things. I think Congo is largely the U.S.'s fault for backing up Mobutu Sese Seko. Massacred that name.
Hmm.
I apologize. The guy who was in charge of Zaire, which became Congo, and then his mismanagement for three
Yeah.
decades. He was essentially a CIA guy, and for 30 years.
What does the CIA get out of that?
Well, that was going back.
I know it might seem silly, but it's almost like you've got this place to, have a territory that you're not doing a whole lot with.
Well, that was Cold War stuff.
Oh, okay. So it was just get as many on your
Yeah,
side as
yeah. And
possible.
then it was actually, and this is actually
Okay.
the case with both Congo and Somalia, is that both of the governments in charge of Congo and Somalia up until 1989, 90 were some of the more heavily subsidized pro-US countries in Africa. Somalia had famously
Hmm.
done a big switch onto our side in the 70s and was rewarded for that. So these were heavily, heavily
Hmm.
funded, murderously terrible people. And the Bush administration,
Yes.
as the Cold War was ending, was sort of realizing, oh man, it is awesome that we don't have to deal with these monstrous dictators anymore. So I think, to our credit, to a
Hmm.
degree, we stopped funding these murderous
Yeah.
dictators. and then both countries fell into nightmarish war. When I look at Somalia and the Congo, I say, well, that's kind of our fault. Much more Somalia, because Somalia had actually arrived at a point of peace and consolidation in 2006 or thereabouts,
Hmm.
and then the Bush administration decided to fund and arm the Ethiopians to destroy it. But Congo, I think, for the better, the United States has not been involved in since the
Hmm.
end of Mobutu. I
For a
mean,
while.
to be clear, I'm sure on many levels, we've certainly got aid programs there that should continue. I'm sure there's intelligence
Hmm. Oh,
activities
yes, yes.
and business corporate skullduggery that's terrible. But the U.S. government does not have a policy that has impacted Congo negatively. So
Yes.
you can argue back and forth whether 21st century deaths in the Congo are the fault of the United States. And I think you'd have a good argument that they're not, but I think they are.
Yeah.
Somalia, however, is 100. What's going on in Somalia now is 100% the U.S.'s fault, as we're currently actively bombing
Hmm.
it. But yeah, Ethiopia is great because unlike almost every other conflict in the world this century that has killed more than 10,000 people, it's
It's weirdly
weirdly
not got
got
anything
nothing
to
to
do
do
with
with the United
America.
States, and that's great. But that gets to your point. It's like, why do
Okay.
we need to do this? We
Yeah.
really, really don't. And it's true that
Hmm.
if the United States were to pull out entirely, stop funding militaries, we should, of course, continue aid.
Like the way they pulled out of
Yeah,
Afghanistan.
very similar. I mean, because I don't think people quite realize that what we're doing in much of Africa right now is actually very similar to what we were doing to Afghanistan in the last couple of years. I mean, we're heavily funding militaries.
Hmm.
We are
It just has not as it's the
the
branding isn't
branding
as
isn't
good.
as good. The financial commitment isn't as high. The commitment of U.S. prestige isn't as
Yeah.
high, obviously, and the amount of money. But it is sort of similar. But if the United States were to just pull out of Africa entirely, because a lot of to be
Hmm.
clear, a lot of the actors that are currently making Congo such a horrifying place are actors that are still heavily funded and trained by the United States. These are outside national
Hmm.
actors, not the militias, though there are hundreds of militias within the Congo. If the United States just pulled out of Africa entirely, stopped providing money for counterterrorism, stopped training militaries, I think you'd have a grim decade or so. But then Africa would become a much
Well,
healthier
yeah.
place.
So very similar to
Yeah,
Afghanistan, but then it can
recover.
actually choose its own path. Are America heavily involved in Rwanda?
We are a big sponsor of Paul.
Because I've heard they're kind of trying to portray like Rwanda as a success story because, compared to the other countries, it's relatively small. So it's easier for America just sort of pile money in and say, isn't everything wonderful? But then they can use that as, their own
Well,
leverage.
so Paul Kagame, again, my pronunciation is terrible there, is the guy who's been in charge
Hmm.
since the Rwanda genocide. In fact, I think led the
Yes.
military out of the sort of militias out of Uganda that stopped the Rwanda genocide. Um, and my understanding is he's quite authoritarian, but has done a
Hmm.
fairly impressive job of knitting the place back together. Yeah, I don't know enough about Rwanda. I haven't made enough of a study of it to say which of the narratives is
Hmm.
more accurate, more plausible.
Plausible.
I do think I'm sure there are things to be said in his benefit. On the other hand, he is a dictator who's been there for
Yeah.
most of 30 years at this point. Uh,
So longer than
yeah,
Putin
yeah, yeah.
and all the horrible things we say
Yeah,
about
and
him.
there's no question in my mind that there are human rights abuses in Rwanda as well. But I want to go back to your initial
Hmm.
point. It's just like none of this is necessary. We haven't been at a
Yeah.
point since industrialization where actually conquering land provided any economic benefit at all. The United States'
Hmm.
emphasis on training militaries in Africa and on counterterrorism actually makes these places more corrupt, privileges militaries. And the really sad thing is, after the Cold War, the 90s were grim in many places in Africa, but actually in the first decade of this century, a lot of
Hmm.
Africa finally recovered from the Cold War, was putting up like
Yeah.
10% growth. Some countries, yeah, in many
GDP.
years, obviously,
Hmm.
We should never talk, Africa is not a country. There's 54 different countries, 54 different stories, but we're talking in
Yeah.
generalities here. A lot of places, a lot of countries did very, very well. And then the United States counterterrorism money started having its effects. And now we're at this point where in the Sahel, I mean, it's like the Cold War again in terms of the numbers of military coups that have been taking
Hmm.
place in African countries over the past 2 or 3 years or so. And they're largely being carried out by guys who were trained by and armed by the United States.
Yeah.
It's just we didn't
Hmm.
need to do that. There wasn't much of a reason. There are more.
Do you think
Sorry.
is there like a training element to it? Like, does America consider this a way of training in case there is a large war? Like, what? It just seems, horrendous. But what is the
It's
justification?
counterterrorism. It's counterterrorism. Yeah.
Just counterterrorism on. It's a bit like the Onion I referred to. It's almost like we just keep doing counterterrorism because no one told us
Well,
not
because
to.
because when we destroyed Libya in 2011, we unleashed all
Yeah.
these torrents of sort of militias and
Hmm.
jihadists, or militias that
Yeah.
decided there was more money and cachet in being jihadist. So now we fund and create. We took out a strongman, which led to a wave of jihadists, and now we are putting all this money to stop the jihadists. That is now leading to a wave of strongmen. So
Oh.
it's all very grim and all very pointless. But if the few times when U.S. or European media will actually talk about what's going on there, it all just gets very simplistic. And look at this is where the jihadists are now. It's like, are they jihadists? Are they
Yes.
freedom fighters? It's all a bit grim. And if I think this sort of like the biggest mistake that the United States is making, that is like the mistake that the British are making, is insisting on militarizing everything, insisting on getting in fights everywhere. Now, I don't think World War III is going to start because the U.S. has some special forces troops who get in a firefight in Mali. That's not going to
Hmm.
happen. But just this constant churn, you never know what's going to do it. You never know what's
Yeah.
going to trigger a bunch of folks in Washington D.C. who are like, "Oh, I demand that our credibility, requires that these two, that we send in 100,000 troops to deal with these two troops, U.S. Special Forces troops that got killed in Mali."
Yeah.
And like that hasn't happened
Hmm.
in this particular political order in the United
Cycle.
States, but 5, 10 years from now, it's very possible.
It
And
could.
we keep
Hmm.
all of these troops all over the world, heavily arming all these militaries all over the place, overcommitting to all these alliances that make it very likely that the conflagration that finally takes the U.S. down or bankrupts the U.S. government will happen sooner
Hmm.
than later. So yeah, it's just we tell ourselves we need an enemy to keep ourselves unified, but
Yeah.
eventually one of these enemies might turn out to be a real threat.
Yeah.
Because that's what happened to the British.
Or trigger an internal decline.
Anything's possible. I mean, if you
Hmm.
want to get even grimmer, I mean, I'd argue that the United States can internally decline for decades or even a century or two before U.S. empire starts to suffer. I think
Hmm.
that you can make
Yeah,
a
it's so powerful and so far ahead. Things can
or
go wrong for a long time.
or the empire can just suck, as I would certainly argue has happened over the past 20 years, can suck progressively more and more resources out
Hmm.
of basic social provision or making a functioning country. Like all
Yeah.
we've spent $7 trillion on weapons over the past 20 years while our infrastructure is falling apart. Because
Yeah.
of the rise of interest rates over the next 4 or 5 years, we're probably going to see a situation where the US government, for the first time in 20 years, actually has to cut budgets a little bit because the interest rates go
Hmm.
up. So, like the amount of money we have to spend to service our debt is going to balloon. So, we're actually going to have to do a little belt tightening. Now,
Yeah.
I think, I hope, I pray that what's likely to win in the battle between the Pentagon and Social Security, our sort of old folks benefit, or Medicare, our old folks medical care, I would hope
Hmm.
that Medicare and Social Security will win. against the Pentagon. But I can't guarantee that, and I can't guarantee that if we do win, that'll continue. The good guys will continue to win on that. So you can have
Yeah,
a military that. I mean, you look at the Roman Empire, and it was a very grim, dark place for its last 300 years or so, but it continued
yeah,
to
but it
expand, and
still took a long time for it to eventually die.
yeah, so it didn't really expand, but it continued to police its borders and get in nasty wars all over the world. So
Well,
yeah,
for a long time, you would easily mix up, the early days of America as Britain, as they would have acted the same way and spoke the same way. They just were like an independent best friend of Britain.
it is kind of interesting. And the more I read about the 19th century, the more I realized it's like, did the United States really win the Revolutionary War? It's sort
Yeah.
of you look at it, and it's there's these two concepts that are pretty important when you look at the British Empire and the United States Empire as well. It's sort of formal and informal empire.
Hmm.
Formal empire, which is what the British had in India, what the United States has in only a few places, like say
Hmm.
Puerto Rico or a wide range of Pacific territories. Is formal empire is super expensive. You got to put a
Oh,
flag there, you
yes.
got to administer it, you got to take
And
care
kill
of
all
things,
the
you got to say,
natives.
yeah, it's terribly terrible. Well, you can kill a lot of natives with informal empire as well, but yes,
Oh,
you
yes.
tend to kill more if it's formal. Whereas informal empire, which I would argue that the British exercised pretty much everywhere in the world, including a lot of countries that were supposedly their sworn enemies, and the
Hmm.
United States does as well, is much cheaper. And honestly, like I feel like the Revolutionary War, in functional terms, the American Revolutionary War, the American War of Independence,
Hmm.
was mostly just a public relations victory for the British. They got to keep funding slavery, profiting from slavery, being the
Yeah.
main financial engine of slavery, while also pretending to abolish slavery.
Oh, yeah. Because
Because
officially in their own, they banned it earlier, didn't they?
they did it very well in some places. They're
Yes.
very, very proud. To this day, any advocate of the British Empire, and even many of its enemies, will tell you, "Oh, well, Britain abolished slavery." And I don't want to be too cynical about this. I think that it was a legitimately new thing, as with
Hmm.
many things post-industrialization, for a country to say, actually, in this entire world that we control, nobody controlled a world before the British did.
Yeah.
Slavery should not be allowed any longer. There were certainly
Hmm.
some jurisdictions that said, well, certain classes of people shouldn't be enslaved anymore. But it was a legitimate novelty that the
Hmm.
British did bring to the world, and that is nice. But I think the actual implementation of it was nowhere near as impressive as the press releases would indicate. I think, for
Because there was
example,
a
as one
lot, you're
example,
suggesting there was a lot of backdoor stuff with the likes of America.
oh, well, there's the backdoor stuff. With the United States was a horrifically late bloomer when it came to abolishing slavery, but the
Hmm.
absolute worst was Brazil, I think, in terms of
Yeah, they
mass
seem to.
industrialized slavery.
I heard one of the sort of comparisons is that you'd have to spend a lot of money on a slave and then maintain them, while with workers you could just hire them one day and if they die, then just hire another one. But Brazil seems to put that on its head because they just seem to mince through them. It was like, yep, give us another boatload and they might last a month.
Well, that was a really horrific dynamic of just sort of Caribbean, Brazilian, and also, I mean, it was marginally less horrific,
Hmm.
um, solely in terms of the way that it churned through human lives
Yeah.
in Northern American climes. But what the point that I wanted to make is that it was in Brazil. It lasted until the 1880s.
Hmm.
And actually, importation, the British did make importation into Brazil, more difficult.
Hmm.
But these places in the United States and Brazil where mass industrialized European style slavery lasted the longest were always bankrolled by the British. You had actual mortgages for the purchase of human life in the United
Yeah.
States. Horrific stuff that British parliamentarians could be like, oh, look at these savage, ex-colonists, they're the worst. While down the street, London banks were financing those mortgages.
It reminds me of modern day London, that the sheer amount of like Saudis and Russian oligarchs have huge amounts of money in London currently. When you consider those are regimes that aren't doing nice things, but yet Britain can let on. It's pro LGBT and not so racist, while still
Yeah.
highly profiting from the backs of horrific individuals.
Britain has changed a lot, but hypocrisy is immortal. It's the other detail on the British abolition of slavery is that in certain places in Latin America, off the west coast of Africa, where it could help British Empire expand, they were very, very scrupulous
Hmm.
about maintaining this anti-slavery coalition. But then you look at Oman, which was somewhere between a British protectorate and a British colony, depending on how you consider things. Your philosophy is how you look at these things.
Yeah,
Slavery was abolished in 1970. That's not 1870. That's
yeah,
1970.
that's
So the
horrific.
whole British empires, the British do deserve some credit
Hmm.
for introducing the concept of abolishing slavery, but this
And was
idea
there
that they
some things you could give them credit for when it came to how the empire dissolved? I heard they basically went to them, you can either be a democracy or stay with us. You can't become like a dictatorship or something weird. When it would seem that other European empires, when they fell apart, kind of didn't care or tried to hang on to them as desperately as possible. When the likes of, was Portugal not still trying to hold on to territory in the 70s?
well, Portugal was definitely the longest lasting, and I
Hmm.
believe was under dictatorship
Yes.
themselves as they were holding on to it. And as soon as they switched to a slightly more modern and rational system, they rather quickly abandoned. But I do
Hmm.
think that the story that the British were somehow better and more handled decolonization in a better way, or were better stewards of their empires, is, I think, also kind of inaccurate. And I've run
Hmm.
videos on this in the past. The reason that British imperial territories, by and large, are better off, and this actually gets a lot to just how in charge the British were in the 19th century, which is sort of one of my
Hmm.
central points that folks tend to avoid. The reason that a lot of British imperial territory is better off after colonization is because a lot of British imperial territory was better off before British
Yeah.
colonization, meaning that the French, the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the
The
Spanish.
Dutch, the
They're
Germans, the
well, so
Belgians.
these are all imperial powers, but sort of the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, who tended to build their empires before the British time in
Yes.
charge, and sort of from the 1750s to 1917, really. If they had a territory that was financially viable and useful, the British took it. Like South
Hmm.
Africa would be a good example. And then when the Germans and the French came on the scene later on, building their international empires, um, they kind of got the scraps. I mean, that's
Yeah.
maybe that's a negative way to talk about these West African countries, or the few islands in the Pacific that the Germans were able to hold.
The Europeans felt they couldn't utilize them as much.
Well, yeah, every place is worthwhile, et cetera, et cetera. But these were places that had less economic rationale for the imperialists. So the reason why there's not much going on in West Africa, I mean, despite the U.S. destruction,
Hmm.
in addition to the U.S. destruction of Libya we discussed earlier, is just there hadn't been a lot of economic activity there for centuries before the French and
Hmm.
Germans got there. So I think that and also this idea that the British just sort of voluntarily left is not true. If you
Oh
just sort of
yes,
look
I
into,
I fully I fully get that, but I feel like they were better at accepting what the future would hold, if that makes any
Ev-
sense.
Eventually, because they
Yeah.
hung on. I mean, they hung on in the Middle East until the '60s when they
Yeah.
flatly could no longer afford it. They held on
Well, that was the
in.
is that the Suez you're talking about?
I'm talking about the Trucial States. I'm talking
Mm-hmm.
about what became the United Arab Emirates in the 1970s
Mm-hmm.
because they realized their identity as the Trucial Kingdoms wasn't going to fly under their new imperial masters, the United States.
Yeah.
Yemen, British held on in Yemen until 1967.
Mm-hmm.
The Kenyan War of Independence, or Mau Mau Rebellion, as I think it's more commonly known, was incredibly savage, incredibly expensive. I think it was somewhat involuntarily, but the British, I mean, held on to aspects of parts of Zimbabwe until like 1980. So I think this sort of
Yeah.
general idea that the British benefited from the extraordinary scale of their empire, in that there are plenty of heartening stories that you can tell about aspects of the British Empire because it was so all encompassing.
Mm-hmm.
But there's plenty of negative reasons as well. So I think that I mean I think you can definitely point to certain countries where exactly what you said was true. Well, I mean, generally, I mean, Sudan. I think the British were barely there really at
Mm-hmm.
any point. They had a massive, extraordinarily expensive expedition in the 1880s or 1890s, escapes me at the second, to avenge some religious fanatic of theirs who had gotten himself killed by another religious fanatic there. And then
Yeah.
really they were barely there
Mm-hmm.
after.
Oh
I mean, it
yeah.
was an
It was hard to hold
extraordinarily
on to.
complex, extraordinary. No, oh no, no, they held on to it. There was no problem in
Mm-hmm.
holding on to it. There was just absolutely no reason for them to be there.
Yeah.
So they painted that part of the map red, and Sudan also comes up as this great example of like, oh well, 4 or 5 white men ran this
Yeah.
country the size of Texas or something like that. And I mean, they weren't really running anything. They were just sort of there, making sure that nobody was
Too
disrespectful of.
rebellious.
Yeah, nobody was like too disrespectful of the British flag or what have you.
Yeah.
So it's so you can tell positive stories
Yeah.
about aspects, sort of places of the British Empire, and I do think you can also tell a positive story about the British were sort of, there are positive aspects to globalization. There are positive aspects to industrialization. And the
Mm-hmm.
British sort of led the way on both of those. And, I don't want to, seem like too much of a negative ninny or something like that. But by and large, I feel like a lot of the narratives we talk about, the British just being friendlier imperialists or
Yeah.
heroic abolishers of slavery sort of misses the bigger.
Well, the fact they were doing slavery in the first place, you could argue.
Well, yes, yes, yes. I think the sort of one of my more classic lines on the British decided to end slavery because they had perfected it and were somewhat aghast at the true industrial horror of what they had created.
Mm-hmm.
And still don't want to take away from the fact that they were horrified and decided to change it, but they also kind of created it. But I
Yeah. Oh,
think,
yeah, yeah. Because was ancient slavery more like indentured servitude?
well, again, there's a million varieties. I
And
think I
yes.
think that there's some people. I think there's a lot of inappropriate. I think slavery, yes, mass industrial slavery of the type that was going on specifically in the Sugar Islands in the southern United States,
Mm-hmm.
in Brazil, reached levels of horror that I don't think anybody
Yeah.
has ever touched. But also, I think people go way too far and being like, well, don't you know that in the Islamic world, all slaves ended up as generals and some of them were sultans, which I think goes way,
Yeah.
way, way too far. I mean,
Oh, yeah, yeah. It's definitely sugarcoating a horrific situation.
yeah, I mean, you had mass. I'm trying to search for the
Deaths.
right term here, but mass transition
Exploitation.
of people into eunuchs. I mean, you would
Hmm.
have boatloads
Yeah.
of folks, boatloads of African slaves sailing. I'm not sure if this was actually performed in Istanbul, but for the sake of simplification, sailing into Istanbul to have their genitals ripped out and
Mm.
serve as eunuchs. I mean, it's slavery is horrific everywhere.
Oh yes.
Slavery was worse in the Caribbean, in the southern United
Hmm.
States. And of course, there were elements of when society was simpler, when industrial scale, because fundamentally the sugar plantations of the Americas, the cotton plantations of the Americas are sort of industrial or proto-industrial outlets.
Yeah.
And when in earlier human eras, when there was less industry in economies, there was less scope for like inhumanity. But you can go back to Roman times and find mines where slaves were used up, not
Hmm.
at the same scale.
But they would have if they could have.
Yeah, being used just as horrifically. So yeah, so I'm
Hmm.
a little skeptical of these narratives around like, oh well, Islamic or ancient slavery was so much better. I think that's a little. I think people can go a little too far in that direction.
And also the romanticization of Greek slavery, and
Exactly, exactly.
little child boys helping you and being squired can always get a bit strange.
Well, that's certainly true. That's the classical Greece and Rome were much stranger and in some ways
Oh yeah, yeah.
grimmer places than we
Give
recall.
them credit for.
Indeed, indeed. But I'm less interested in sort of litigating like the goods and the evils of British Empire than I am in just talking about the historical misconception that people have of the 19th century and of this
Hmm.
idea that the British Empire and the United States and the U.S. Empire were such fundamentally different things. One of my central arguments is that actually the U.S. Empire and the British Empire are really the only two things, or rather, the only thing that you can realistically compare the United States Empire to is the British Empire. And the only thing you can
Oh
realistically
yeah.
compare the British Empire to is the US Empire, because these are the only two empires in human history that were true world empires
Hmm.
and came along after industrialization. And I think that people don't quite understand specifically. I feel bad that I keep bringing this guy up because I think he's a positive influence in some ways
Yeah.
on the discourse. But Peter Zeihan is a geopolitical analyst who's pretty
Hmm.
popular. Is doing very well recently. I think one of the reasons he's so popular is because he's was one of the first people to point out that, hey guys, like China's not going to end up as dominant as you are all talking about. In fact, like China's got a big crisis coming, and I think
Well,
that.
yeah, it's got a lot of crises. I just sort of think, I know this is a minor point, but
Mhm,
every time they talk about China, it's almost like, they've got a billion and a bit people ready just to invade,
mhm.
when most of the time that's 1.3 billion mouths to feed on a daily basis, which then raises a huge number of challenges.
Oh, of course, and we talked. I think we talked last episode. We talked at length about how China's got more problems than opportunities at this point. But Peter Zeihan was
Oh
sort
yeah,
of.
I would just like to keep everything together. If they could keep things as they were, I'm sure they would take it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But Peter Zeihan, I think, is a positive influence because he was one of the first people to really be talking about this. But I also think he gets a lot of things wrong. And one of the main things that he gets wrong is his complete misunderstanding of the 19th century. He sets up this very influential, increasingly influential picture of the world where before the United States agreed to keep trade safe after 1945, as a sort of a Cold War agreement. Everybody sides with us against the Soviets, and the United States makes this beneficial sort of Bretton Woods accommodation with the world and
Yeah,
allows everybody to benefit from safe, free trade, this, that, and the other thing. And really, before that, it was all the 19th century and all the time before it was just empires fighting against each other and
yeah,
mercantilism and this, that, and the other thing, which is just a fundamental misunderstanding of human history. That is not what the 19th century was. that was
Hmm.
actually what the 16th century was, or the 17th century, and into maybe the first half of the 18th century. That is kind of what was going on, competing empires, what have you. But in the 19th century, after the Napoleonic Wars, Britain was so incredibly titanically dominant, that it was able to set up a system that was obviously very different. We're talking 130 years difference here, technology,
Hmm.
society, et cetera, et cetera. But from 1815 until, with very small breaks up until 1914 and the beginning of World War One, Britain had set up a sort of form of globalization, a form of free trade where almost exclusively white European people and Americans could benefit
Hmm.
from the kinds of benefits that Peter Zeihan claims were only provided in the post-World War II era, which is just simply incorrect, and sort of, I think, misunderstands what the world looks like and how the world functions. And I think by making that misunderstanding, by not understanding that what the British built before the Americans looked very similar to what the Americans had built, you can develop this sense, which I think Peter Zeihan has, which is that with American disinterest or the United States becoming marginally less interested in having all their factories in China, then all of a sudden the
Hmm.
world's going to fall into chaos. And I just don't think that's true. I just don't think that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, it just doesn't track for me, and I think that's a real problem. It's just not quite understanding how similar the British and American empires were, and I think it gets that informal versus formal empire distinction that I was talking about
Yes.
earlier. Because I think we understand that the British, it's funny. I think that the phrase like the sun never set on the British Empire or something like that.
Yes.
I think that actually isn't initially British. I think that might go back to the Habsburgs, but I'm not entirely
Okay.
certain of that.
Well, you heard the old Indians saying about it.
No.
The sun never set on the British Empire because God doesn't trust the British in the dark.
Oh, that's a great. That is a that I've never heard that. It's
It's a
hilarious.
lovely little retort.
Yeah, yeah, no, that makes sense. But so the British are famous for painting the map red or this, that, and the other thing.
Yes.
But I think what's undersold is their informal empire, and the
Hmm.
many different ways that they were able to control countries that were never painted red. I think the Ottoman
Yeah.
Empire, I think modern Turks, I think derive some pride from the fact that the Ottoman Empire was never fully conquered, other than sort
Hmm.
of for I don't know, a year or two there in the aftermath of World War One. Istanbul was controlled by outside powers, but Ataturk then quickly threw people out. But through a lot
Hmm.
of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire signed a number of treaties with the British that involved like the British, I think in some degree of partnership with the French, ran the Ottoman central bank, ran, Ottoman customs.
It's quite a lot of sovereignty.
Yeah, exactly. At a
Hmm.
certain point, the Ottomans, the Chinese, rather similarly, were giving up so much sovereignty that you begin to wonder whether they were really independent from Britain at all.
Yeah, or nearly a vassal state.
Exactly, exactly. And it's I think that informal empire and the way that I was talking about how the United States was independent, loudly, proudly,
Hmm.
belligerently independent. You had multiple periods over the course of the 19th century. I think in the 18, I think it's in the 1850s in particular, over Nicaragua and other sort of outstanding issues in the Caribbean.
Yeah.
The British and the Americans were going to go to war, and then earlier in the 1840s, they were going to go to war over Oregon. And if you just focus on what the national press and what the politicians of those eras, both in the U.S. Congress and the British Parliament, were saying, it seems like these are independent countries with real competition going on. But if you begin
Hmm.
to read the economic history, you're just like, wait a second, like it's like the biggest things the most impressive aspects of the U.S. economy were largely financed by the British. Like
Oh yeah, yeah.
the Louisiana Purchase itself, Thomas Jefferson's big, semi-unconstitutional move to buy
Mm-hmm.
Louisiana, and I think it probably makes up 5 to 10 modern states today.
Yeah.
That property, that finance, the money for that, buying it from Napoleon, was put up by Barings Bank, was put up by a British bank. It's kind
Wow.
of extraordinary. So the British just controlled the world in the 19th century in ways that are very similar to the way that the United States controls the world today. A lot of the levers were
Mm-hmm.
financial, they were legal, they were ownership of companies, corporate skullduggery. This is the news over the past week hasn't necessarily been about international. Well, I suppose it has actually. The explosion of this crypto exchange in the Bahamas, which is the Bahamas are still somewhat affiliated with Britain or entirely independent. I'm not entirely sure. Regardless of the sort of origins of that tax haven, these sort of questions of international finance are a little more rarefied. They're a little more attenuated now in the 20th century than they were in the 19th, but they were quite similar. The sort of financial bubbles, the scale upon which financial interactions could direct world events or what have you. Like there was the same deal during the British Empire. So the British Empire and the U.S. Empire are very, very similar. That's why I think that understanding the 19th century and understanding the British Empire is so important to just understanding the world today.
That was quite a grim end to proceedings.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
The More Freedom Foundation is also available on YouTube and TikTok. Rob's Twitter is RobOLaw, and he's also written a book called Avoiding the British Empire: What It Was and How the US Can Do Better.
Yeah, dead space, Rory. We can't have dead space.